Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast.
Since this is an episode about ethics and marketing and advertising, I'm going to be fully transparent with you. This is a really difficult conversation for me, mostly because I just don't think about it that much. I hope this is a really great episode for you so you can think about it some more. And please stick with us. There's a couple technical difficulties, but it's a great episode.
And one final note, if you love listening to this podcast, please leave a review in Apple or Spotify. We really appreciate it.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber Podcast, a place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Mark Binkley and Vasilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
Welcome back to the Sleeping Barber. Today, it's a really fascinating topic, speaking about ethics and marketing. I think we'll probably get more into the data side of it. But today, we've got Amina Mattern here from LinkedIn, industry strategy lead with LinkedIn Marketing Solutions, specifically for the financial services and fintech. Amina, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Truthfully, this is not a topic I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is shame on me. Other than maybe I recognize the value in, that's not the right way to say it. I recognize there's a huge responsibility for marketers to do the right things. Obviously, you don't want to mislead customers, but you also don't want to give away their data, and you need to have protection. And so there's also a whole bunch of stuff on media placements in terms of ethics and where you're placing media. It's a really interesting topic, and I'm really glad you're here to talk with us about it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start with just a real softball question? Literally, that's how it's written down. So I'm going to use this word because I love it. Can you just tell us how, we met, our paths have crossed, but can you tell us how you got into this position at LinkedIn and why you're interested in ethics and marketing?
Yeah, absolutely. So my career has largely always spanned marketing strategy, marketing effectiveness, of course, is a part of that. And specifically, I graduated with a degree in journalism, print journalism to be exact, right at the time when print journalism was dying. And so that really opened the doors into digital advertising. It was this new thing. It was a new way to connect with consumers. And so that's really how I got my foot in the door. And I've spent the last 15 years in marketing strategy across various roles, client side, agency side, internationally in Dubai as well as Canada. And LinkedIn really was a desirable place to work because they sit at this intersection of, social media, but it's also a tool to drive professional connections and ultimately to drive economic opportunity for people. So it was the intersection of all of those things that drew me to LinkedIn and to this role specifically.
Cool. Thanks.
That's one thing I do love is your experience spans multiple things. You touched on this. You touched on agency. You worked for MediaCom, Omnicom. Then you led media for Loblaws there for a bit too. I'd love to understand just when we think about all the different intersections that you've had, how has that changed over time when you start adding the layer of what it's called ethics and advertising? Because you've done it from the agency side, you were client side, now you're at that intersection at LinkedIn. How has your views perhaps changed over that time?
Yeah, I think the advent of digital advertising has evolved throughout those 15 years, right? When I started in the industry, there was just Twitter, then came Facebook, and then came all of the other platforms, right? And with that came this huge sort of influx of consumer data, right? Every time you interact with one of these platforms, it's an exchange of data. And so data has become this new currency almost, whether you're client side, whether you're vendor tech side, right? The richness of your first party data is largely what determines the effectiveness of your targeting, the effectiveness of your business operations. And so it really has evolved over time. And with that raises this question of ethics, right? How do you leverage this vast amount of data that you're sitting on in a way that engenders consumer trust. You're not misusing it. You're not misleading consumers. So it really is sort of at the forefront now of everything that we do, I would say.
Mm-hmm. It's
Such a
as
good
you were
point.
saying that, it made me think of like we have almost an infinite amount of storage, at very, very low costs. And so we end up like almost as pack rats with all this data that we may not actually ever do anything with, but we're collecting it all.
Oh
And
man.
so then there's like a responsibility with that too, like as far as, yeah, you may have intentions, but then again, you may not actually do anything with it. So there's like some responsibility in terms of just protection of data sets, and probably a responsibility to get rid of some of it too if you're not going to do anything.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? And that's why you're seeing this massive onslaught of legislation that's come with it. It's not just about the accumulation of data, but it's how are you storing it? Where is it being processed? Do consumers know even what types of data, right? Every time you log on, it gives you this vague little box and you check it without giving it a second thought. But
Totally.
what does that actually mean, right? Where is this data being processed? And that's why you're seeing EU legislation, Digital Services Act, consumer protection in California, right? These are all designed because regulatory bodies are finally understanding that there can be massive amounts of damage done if these companies are not held to certain standards, right? So it's going to become an increasingly hot topic. I would argue even more so with the advent of AI and all of that storage. I mean, you mentioned the storage of data, right? So Microsoft every single day is building new storage centers and data centers. Every single day, a new one is being built just to harness this massive amount of data that's about to be generated through AI.
Mm-hmm. I think V, you and I were looking at a news story somewhere about, I think Microsoft was in the category of companies looking to invest in nuclear energy to power their data centers, like as in building their own nuclear reactors, just to have the energy required to operate these things. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is.
So, like, as far as the principles and ethics, you mentioned a couple of the state, like the California state. We had Castle here in Canada. There's the GDPR. There's all these things. Like, I remember when V and I first started working together, Castle just had come out, and it was kind of radical at the time, where you're like, you have to get consent from somebody before you send them something. And at the time, we're like, what? This is ridiculous. How are we supposed to reach anybody? It's evolved a lot since then. I wonder if you can, like, I know you're not going to be able to get into specifics about all of them, but like, what's the general trend on the ethics and the guidelines around some of these policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one part of it is around the collection of data. So what are you collecting and how are you collecting that? And has consent truly been given if, the consent box is this big and people are just clicking it without realizing? The second part of that is, data scientists don't even know today what that data may be used for in the future. Right. So how can you give consent when a future use case has not even been developed, right? So that's the second layer of it. And then it comes to the processing of data, targeting in specific regions where perhaps consumers have not given explicit consent, like in the EU, right? Regardless of where you're headquartered, if you are targeting consumers in the EU, so there raises the question of global consent, right? Will we ever reach that? Because every country is so different with their laws and regulations. So I think, Yuval Noah Harari, who's a famous sort of author and speaks largely around these issues of ethics and advertising, he brings up this point that how can we ever reach true consent when it's not an international body that's governing this, right? It's each different country or each different state, even within the US, or province in Canada. So it is a very fragmented, I would say, issue today. Even there's no clear boundaries.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Amina. And when we think about the trust element for a lot of brands, have you seen, or is there a lot of research to suggest that, you know, brand reputation is able to increase when they have a reputable way of capturing consent? Or do you have some great examples that you could potentially highlight that of organizations that do this really well?
Absolutely. I think Apple is a prime example, right? So data and privacy is very much ingrained in their brand ethos. It always has been. If you think about it, Apple is arguably sitting in one of the most rich first-party data sets in the world, right? Everybody has an iPhone in their pocket, and every time you unlock it and use it, there's an exchange of data. And so, you know, leveraging that data for them, they take it very seriously. They've never transgressed on that. And in fact, it is very much, like I mentioned, a part of their brand DNA. And then on the flip side, you know, you have instances like Cambridge Analytica and Meta, who has had to revamp their entire brand image from Facebook to Meta in order to get away from some of these transgressions around data that they've been accused of throughout the years, and quite frankly continue to be accused of. And so I think the way that you handle data and privacy is very much a part of your brand.
Yeah, V and I we're just taking a quick look at app tracking transparency, and noticed like there are differences across different countries as well. So like to your earlier point, and to some of the standards I think that are being set by organizations, I wonder how much it has to do with like the local environment. So for example, like on this app tracking stat, the United Arab Emirates has a 50% opt-in rate, whereas Canada is near the bottom at 23% opt-in rate. So I feel like maybe some consumer expectation around this as well that's sort of shaping how companies respond. Did you see that at all?
Yeah, of course. I think ATT has hugely changed the landscape, right? I think brands have always operated under this assumption that consumers want to be bombarded with messaging and ads. But if you look at the data, like you mentioned, across countries from Apple and their tracking limitations, overwhelmingly it shows consumers don't want to be tracked. And so why do we think that consumers want to be tracked on the open internet or on the web, across websites, right? The data would suggest that consumers don't want to be tracked. Then I think, Mark, you bring up a good point around the differences between opt-in rates across different regions and countries. And I think that also brings up a good question around digital literacy, right? Certain countries are more digitally literate than others. And I think that's important too. Are we, teaching populations on how to leverage apps and websites appropriately? And it's important because, apps like TikTok, etc., that have very large young demographics, sometimes I would argue they don't know how to leverage it appropriately, right? So it raises a lot of ethical questions.
You bring up such a great point, especially around if we use ATT almost like as a proxy to say if 23% of Canadians are opting in to being tracked on their phones, why are we okay to use on the open web this sense of like implied consent? The moment that you interact with a web page, the moment that you add something to cart, the moment that you do all these things, now you're chased throughout your experience on the web with like either product specific like ads, service specific ads, and things to that effect. And it's weird, like there's almost like a double standard there. It's like I'm I'm actively saying no on my device. I don't want to be tracked, but then I can't avoid being tracked in the open web. So my question to you is like, what are some of the challenges in ethics that a lot of, a lot of various industries are actually being faced with managing these two things, because they feel like they're different, but they're actually very much more the same than they are different, but we treat them differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to this notion of data being a currency, right? And so the more that you're able to leverage it, the stronger your targeting becomes. Arguably, some would argue that that's also linked to driving, more revenue for your company, more sales, more product sales. So it begs the question again of what is that fine balance between allowing companies to operate, for-profit companies, right? These companies are, at the end of the day, they're needing to make money. It's their revenue generating organizations, with something like the data overwhelmingly demonstrating that consumers don't want to be tracked. They don't want to be giving their data for, being chased around the internet and bombarded to buy. So whose responsibility is it? It begs the question. Is it the regulators and governments, which, again, the limitation there is they're localized bodies, right? They're not international bodies. And then on the other hand, some would argue the onus is on the companies. But companies, again, to my earlier point, are for profit. That's why they exist.
Yeah.
And so whose responsibility is it at the end of the day?
I think government is really like their role is to protect the people. Companies got to protect themselves. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but like the company will protect themselves because they're a legal entity and they have to. It occurred to me that, going back to that conversation that we just had about the question or comment about, all this data stuff that's going on. If you have any data, the more any data, you're at risk. But the more data that you collect, the more your own company's at risk, which is a legal challenge and legal problem because you could get hacked and all that kind of stuff. So it almost seems to me like if you're doing any kind of customer data collection whatsoever, ethics need to be a part of your foundational like strategy as like from day one, not like as an afterthought when you get hacked. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so. And it's evident in the companies, at least the large ones, in which it has been paramount from the beginning versus tacked on at the end, because now there's regulation and laws being put into place and they're being summoned by, European commissions and all sorts of bodies. And I think, LinkedIn has always, for me at least, the first thing that they will ever tell you when you join the company is members first. It's this notion of members first. And so what does that really mean? It means data and privacy and members will always come first. The company will not function without that value very deeply ingrained and in place. And so it's everything, right? It's once you lose trust, it is very, very difficult to rebuild it from a brand perspective or from a company's perspective. And so it very much has to be there from the beginning if you are taking it seriously and not just this afterthought because now you're being summoned and, there's more oversight being given to your company and its operations.
Man, and remember how we said at the onset, we're going to likely meander? Well, here I am going to meander a little bit, but I think this is important. When we think about the cookie deprecation right now, it's almost creating a level set or an opportunity to rethink a lot of these different frameworks. And when I think about, Meta and Google, they have CAPI enhanced conversions, and they're really trying to create even closer ties with that first party data than it just being passed through the cookie side. But that's also raised a lot of questions at the organization level. Like, are we comfortable doing that? And there's some organizations that are comfortable doing it. The others are a little bit more are not. Do you see the cookie deprecation as a good thing or as a bad thing?
I mean, I think that's a nuanced question, right? I think that there are definitely benefits.
No, it has to be black or white.
Yeah.
You go.
No grayness allowed.
No
gray. But unfortunately, it's one of those things that, it's an archaic sort of technology. It's been ripe for disruption for a very long time. And so I think on that front, yes. But then on the flip side, it opens itself up to the alternatives, right? You mentioned some of them, Conversions API or CAPI for short, server to server connections. And how comfortable are we passing that data? Now, there are solutions like clean rooms out there in which provide a little bit more safeguard or guardrails, let's say, around that. But then it depends on the industry, right? What type of data are you talking about? I work largely with financial services, which is already a heavily regulated industry itself, right? We're talking about very personable data that they're not comfortable sharing. And so I think it does
100%.
depend industry to industry as well, right? So something like CAPI has its benefits, sure, but will it be broadly applicable to every single industry out there? No.
Yeah.
No.
I wonder, like, can you... it depends answer is perfect. I know I was pushing for gray or black or white, but but I'm joking and saying black or white, but this is the thing about ethics conversations for me that gets hard to follow the bouncing ball, because a lot of the answers depends, because there's not always a clear yes or a clear no. And so I wonder, like, if in your mind, are there like some really simple guidelines that people should think about when they're talking about ethics, like to sort of distill it, not necessarily as a black or white, but like things you should just think about, whether you're a small company, and it probably changes if you're a large company, so it depends on that one too. But
yeah, I think there are key principles around ethics in advertising. So the one would be transparency, right? Everything that you do should be transparent. Those policies should be easily accessible on your website if a consumer would like to read up more about it, right? So there's transparency. There's honesty, right? Are you being honest with the way that you are leveraging your data and your data strategy? The avoidance of deception, right? So you need to be able to prioritize a consumer's interests and, quite frankly, societal well-being in general. These are fundamentals, I would say, as it pertains to ethical advertising. But then again, it brings up the question of whose responsibility is that, right? Is it the companies? Is it government bodies? Who's largely responsible for that? It also brings up the question of, are we talking about ethics in terms of the content itself? Meaning, like, what is the communication or the messaging coming from a brand or an organization? Or are we talking about the distribution of that content, right? Are you distributing it on platforms that are known to be ethical, that are known to safeguard data, and put privacy at the forefront? So I think that distinction needs to be made in that the medium sometimes is the message, right? As Marshall McLuhan says, if you are distributing it on platforms that have been accused of misusing data, I don't need to name names. I think we all know some of the worst offenders in this category. But if you are leveraging those platforms to distribute your campaigns and your communications, then you are, by proxy, supporting those companies, right? It's your ad dollars that are flowing through those companies. So on one hand, it's ethics in your own communications coming from your brand, but where are you distributing those?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I'll name names. So like what one of the things that comes up, I mean, right now we're in a US election cycle, and not to criticize or critique anyone, but it's interesting because there's an ethics debate in the messaging between the two candidates or the two parties. But this is where I think it also is challenging, maybe where governments, weirdly enough, they are governments, but they need to step in, because what is the truth to one group is a falsehood to another group. So who decides what is, accurate and well represented and not misleading? Because sometimes the brands themselves don't feel like that's misrepresentation in messaging, but the other side might. And in this case, the U.S. government presidential race is like their government, so the government itself can't agree on what that is. So it's interesting because it is like challenging to identify what the truth is.
Yeah, and I think, as it pertains to political advertising, again, it's the most glaring example would be Cambridge Analytica, right? The misuse of that data influenced the result of an election. Like, that is not to be taken lightly, right? There were serious implications as a byproduct of Facebook's decision to sell consumer data. And that's not just a one and done incident, right? Even as of 2022, that was 2 years ago, they were accused of doing something very similar, where they excluded large demographics from being targeted in campaigns, right? Which they were accused of promoting bias and discrimination against certain racial groups and ethnicities. So this isn't something that doesn't have consequences in the real world. It's something that can cause a lot of damage, and it has a lot of political sway attached to it. Yeah. But these companies, they have lobbyists. I read somewhere, it may have been through one of Scott Galloway's books or Kara Swisher, but they had mentioned that, these companies have hired more lobbyists than the Wall Street Journal employs journalists. So that should be telling in the amount of power that they have to sway decision-making around some of these issues.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. We've talked about the role of government, companies, and kind of like where does the responsibility live. My question to you is, what's the responsibility on the consumer themselves? Because I think there's one part of it where, yes, I think it's very easy to, I'm not going to say point the finger, but it's very easy to say organizations have to take an active stance on what ethics and what we're doing with the data. Yes, agreed. Governments also need to find a way maybe to create more of these governing structures that these companies now have to abide to. But how about the consumer themselves? What role do they have to make sure that ethics are adhered to, followed, especially when it comes to data collection?
I think, and this is a personal opinion, of course, but I think the consumer is probably the last on the totem pole when it comes to the responsibility, right? And the example or the reasoning that I'll provide is, again, connected to digital literacy. So in countries, I'm originally from Pakistan, but in countries, like Pakistan and India, the overall literacy rate is very low. But then you think about digital literacy and it's, almost non-existent, right? So even in countries like Myanmar, et cetera, it's has resulted in very low digital literacy rates, meaning that consumers don't have the tools or the knowledge access required to leverage and use these platforms in a way in which they know, how to use them appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that then that raises the question of there's disparities between countries, right? And so if one was to say, okay, it is on the consumer, maybe in countries like North America, where consumers are very savvy and literate around how to leverage these platforms, but not in countries like Pakistan, India, Myanmar, where they simply don't know, right? So how do you produce programs or educate vast majorities of populations in those types of countries?
That's a great point.
Yeah, that's a great point. Oh, I know. Just kidding.
It's tough.
I have no clue. It is tough. But and I think there's also an implied it's not consent. It's like, let's say I keep thinking about just purchasing anything online with ecom. Like, a lot of people do it. And as a consumer, that I'm doing it shouldn't. Do I need to be responsible for my own data for having made a purchase online?
Exactly.
I don't know. Like, I don't know. Maybe I do. Maybe it's going to get to that point where I have to think about all that. But even at that, like, I don't know how to even control the data I'm giving over to them, because I don't know what the data is that I'm giving over to them, other than a credit card, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And even the companies themselves will admit, right, that it goes back to use cases. The use cases today will not be the use cases of tomorrow.
Speaking of which, perfect segue, Amina. I wanted to ask you about, like, synthetic data. Like, is there different ideas around ethics when it comes to synthetic data? Like, you could do market research on a sample size of 0, as an example. But have you seen any kind of conversation or thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think the notion of synthetic data is new, but it is catching a lot of traction. There are two individuals, who used to lead the B2B Institute at LinkedIn. They have now left, and they've started their own company. So Peter Weinberg and John Lombardo, I'm sure you know them, but this is their whole sort of thing, right? Is how to leverage synthetic data in a way that's effective, et cetera. But admittedly, that's not sort of, I don't have a very deep understanding of that side of things. But from what I do know, or from what I've heard from them, is it can be equally as effective.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess where my head was going with that one is, like, there's a responsibility just because you can get data now you don't have a valid, that's not the right way to say it. You may not have accurate data. And so if you're using synthetic data, who knows what the data is? And so you could be making assumptions based on the synthetic data, which then has this cascading effect, because then you're implementing that data, which might have biases and all kinds of things embedded in it that you don't even realize, because you just used it. It was there, rather than validating it and doing, like, sort of a journalist fact check. Like, is it a quality data?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, even with the sort of advent, I will not say advent, because obviously AI has been around for a long time, but it was largely a back office thing with engineers, data architects, but now it's become sort of a front office thing where everybody is leveraging it. But the argument is very much the same, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. So if you are inputting incorrect data or incorrect facts that have not been verified by, journalistic integrity, you're not getting proper, accurate responses or data back. But then there's also the flip side of that argument, that they would say, actually, the more that you input, the more accurate it will get. So which side do you sit on? Do you trust that? Because obviously more data, you have more of a base to form accuracy around, or not. I don't know. It's a very interesting question.
Obviously, this is going to evolve over time. You talked about AI on the onset and how that's going to set a totally different. It's going to shift us in a totally different way of not only consuming data, the way data is collected, et cetera, et cetera. My question to you is, when you look at the future of ethics and advertising, what do you see as being something that becomes really prominent for us over the next, call it 5 to 10 years? And what is even further outside of that? Now, that may be really hard to really kind of, because we just don't know what the environment will look like. But if we look at a shorter midterm, what do you see as like the future of ethics in advertising?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I think the organizations that take it seriously will inevitably come out on top. And I know I've provided the example of Apple. I think Microsoft is another sort of strong example here. But when it comes to ethics and industry leaders and organizations, they have to foster this culture of ethics being very much a part of their day-to-day operations, right? So what does that actually mean? It means conducting regular audits and being okay with being audited frequently. It means providing ongoing training to, not just the frontline people, like your sales people, et cetera, but every single person in your organization needs to understand what your data and your privacy strategy is. Every single person from top to bottom. Establishing and monitoring reporting mechanisms for compliance, right? And all of this really is to produce a secure space for creativity and innovation while protecting and respecting community. Right? I think those two things can be achieved side by side, but it is going to require taking it seriously.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I mean, there is a lot of room to play within the rules. Like, you don't have to go outside of the rules. And sometimes, like, it is just educating yourself about what the rules are to make sure you're comfortable with what you're doing. And you might be doing the exact right things, but I feel like that the training and education component is really critical, because it's like, I would say I'm at the beginning of my journey with respect to ethics and that kind of stuff. Like, there's certain areas of marketing and advertising I spend a lot of time in, and other areas where I don't. And the ethics part of it is one of those areas I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but its impact is massive, and the risk is huge for a company.
Yeah.
If you don't get it right. And so to start, it feels to me like just self-education, self-training, talking to people like you is a really good starting point. Because now I'm a little bit more aware of it. Now I can ask a bit more intelligent questions about some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think ethics in advertising, it's not just this nice to have anymore, right? It's a must have. Like I mentioned, we're in this era where trust is the ultimate currency. Maintaining ethical standards, it's not just about compliance, it's really about the survival of these companies. And then as we navigate a digital age, right, we have to remember that technology is not a substitute for ethics. AI, big data, other advancements, they're going to offer these incredible opportunities for personalization and efficiency, but they're going to bring on a whole host of new ethical challenges. And so it really becomes about ensuring that these tools are used responsibly, with respect for privacy, transparency, and fairness at the end of the day, right? Advertising is not just about reaching more people. It's about reaching them in a way that respects their rights and their values and their intelligence. And advertising is about people. It's always been about people, right? And people deserve respect and consideration at the end of the day. And the ethical path, I believe, is also the most sustainable one. I've never been a short-term sort of gimmicky marketer, right? For me, it's all about building long-term strategies for sustainable growth. And that has to include ethics, because once you erode trust, that's it, right? So That's the way that I see it.
Can I put a request in for LinkedIn? Let's say, can you guys figure out an ethics button we can just hit and do a check on everything I'm doing and make sure it's okay? And then I'll be absolved of it all, and that would be great.
Can I put in a request? I thought you were going to request a song or something. I really love the line, technology is not a substitute for ethics. I think that in of itself is exactly the way we have to think about it as we move forward, as almost being kind of like that litmus test. Even though we're adopting new technology, how are we making sure we're really critical and the ethical implications of this technology? How are we governing it? How are we making sure that there's more and more education around it? It's a fascinating topic, and honestly, Amina, like, this has been such a great conversation, and I hope, even through our platform, we're able to raise even a little more awareness around the importance of ethics in advertising, why marketers should be leaning in a lot more, and don't just assume organizational things are being handled the way it's supposed to be. Make sure you're a voice in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that you are thinking it through the lens of the consumer, why it is important, and don't just try to look at it like, how do I get my first party data out there to try to retarget to them? It's like, are you doing it in an ethical way?
Mm-hmm.
Should you? Anyways, so yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it, right? And like, there will be like regulations and this and that, but at the end of the day, your gut should tell you, is this the right thing to do or is it not? Like, it isn't. It's and then do that thing, right? Do the right thing, regardless of who's watching or which watchdog is, putting guardrails around you. Just do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Do the right thing.
This is like Spike Lee movie right now. Do the right thing. This is awesome, Amina. Thanks so much for joining us and hanging in with us through some of the tech challenges we had. It was really fun to chat with you about this. And super, like V said, it's such an important topic.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
If you like this show, please leave a review. And even if you didn't, we'd love to make this show better, and your feedback will help us do that. Post-pod.
A little more excitement. It's the post-pod with V and Marc.
Yes.
Who's excited?
I'm excited.
I'm excited.
Hands up.
Let's go.
Let's get into this. Like, we were just joking at the beginning that we have the best conversations when we hit stop on the recording. And then we did, again, have the most amazing conversation. So let's carry this.
Every time.
Okay, so a couple things that came up after we stopped recording. I just want to flag this with Amina. Well, not flag it with Amina, but flag it with you so we can maybe talk about this. So algorithms, we didn't really get into during the conversation, but the algorithm optimizing for things like, there's all these mental health issues and stuff that keep coming up in part because of like the data that's being used is just generating attention or being used to generate attention, which is creating some of this mental health issue, which then makes you wonder about the ethics of advertising on certain platforms or not. So that would be one. And then there's this, well, let's just start there. What do you think?
Man, I was talking about this just again right when we were kind of closing up with Amina, but when I look at the way my parents are inundated with a lot of this information that's based on algorithms, I'll give you an example. I would argue they're fairly religious. So like the content that they consume on, say, YouTube and things like that have to align somewhat to their religious beliefs. But we also know like religion at sometimes can create like these echo chambers. So then by doing so, they're only subjected to one point of view on the religious side. And sometimes like we'll get into these conversations and you're like, this is not my dad talking to me. Someone else is talking to me right now. Yeah. And it's because there's an assumption on the algorithm, because you watched this, there is a likely probability that you may be interested in this topic. Yeah. And that is an assumption that the algorithms are making based on other signal that they're getting on based on these audiences. And it becomes extremely dangerous because without people realizing your new opinions or your thoughts are being reshaped with inaccurate information.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about ethics in advertising, there's a big play here on ethics in the content that is available to the masses. But then the onus does go on the consumer there. It's like, oh, you know what? I don't want to engage myself in this type of conversation. But the algorithms already picked it up as a signal. And this is the problem, right? So unless you're going back, you're clearing your histories, you're removing everything, which a lot of people don't.
Totally.
You're kind of stuck in this place. So it could be a moment in time you're interested in one topic, something. It's like, hey, I want to find out more here. All of a sudden, that's a signal. So you're on TikTok, you're on Instagram, you're on YouTube. Doesn't matter. All the platforms do this, and you're just inundated with this information constantly. And it's dangerous. It is so dangerous. And I don't think having this conversation is the first step. I think driving more awareness to this is really, really important. But we have to hold ourselves as marketers also to a higher level of accountability within organizations, and how do we practice data and data sharing ethically. It concerns me, if I'm honest, Mark. Like I don't know.
Yeah, I'm with you. Like there's a conversation about just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so there's a line that I think it's for all of us to decide on, what is the can line and what is your should line. And, it may not be the same, but if you can get those closer together, we should do this because we can do this, or we can do this and we should do this. Like if you can get those two lines together and close that gap, I think it's good. Example for me, I again, we said this to Amina when we were not recording, but we used Zoom Info at a company I was at previously. And the idea there was you can put in all your targeting criteria of the kinds of people you want to reach. You can then pay for it, and you download all of this PII that's available. So you can then build out lists and then target them with email campaigns and so on and so forth. So you can do that. You can do that. But should you do that is kind of dependent on whether or not your company believes that that's the right thing to do. If you're in Canada, there's lots of rules that say you shouldn't because it's not consent. Then state by state, to Amina's point earlier, like California's got different rules than say Ohio. And so there's all kinds of things you got to consider. And so just because you've done something before, that's the way we do things around here, doesn't necessarily mean that's the should part. Doesn't mean you should do it that way going forward.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's really important, I think, especially when it comes to trust and, any kind of, like imagine having a leak of all your customer data. Like how much of a problem would that be?
Well, we've seen it.
Yeah.
Like look at the Home Depot case.
Yeah.
Like that in of itself was like a big wake up call for a lot of organizations that have been leaning on a lot of these data sets.
Yeah.
And it's what is the voice of the marketer in this? It's a pretty loud one.
Yeah.
Remember, we are the voice of the consumer inside these organizations.
Yeah.
We have to hold ourselves to a higher level of accountability with a lot of our targeting practices and the ways that we go to market. And I don't think that I don't believe, and I'm making a generalization here, I know I am, I don't know how many of us are actively thinking about this every day.
Yeah.
Because we're very comfortable in saying, let's just remarket this audience and suppress them this way. It's like, do you hear yourself?
Yeah. Well, it's a good point, because there's also this influence everywhere about, the move is towards first party data. Cookies are going away, so let's move towards first party data. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. We can. Should we? Like asking the question is really important. Or if like maybe the bridge question is, what would have to be true? Again, this is a Roger Martin and Jennifer Real thing, I think. But what would have to be true for that to be a good idea?
Yeah.
which is really important, I think, to ask some questions before you just go ahead and do it.
Totally. Yeah, I don't know. So Amina shared a few. Well, she shared a lot of great thoughts. But the one thing is we like to think of frameworks here as much as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and she highlighted like 3 things. So the first one being like make sure like as an organization you're really transparent,
Mm-hmm.
you're really honest, and you have this lens of like social well-being kind of at the heart of everything that essentially that you do and you think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a great way to. At first, even assess your current state. You can use those 3 areas and saying, how transparent are we?
Yeah.
We aren't very transparent. Are policies actively accessible to the public?
Yeah.
Yes, no, maybe. Are we being honest with the way that we're using the data? Or are we being kind of creative in the wording and how, we're manipulating the words that could imply multiple things? So
Yeah.
how honest are you actually? And then finally, thinking about it from a well-being or social well-being perspective is like, again, should we?
Mm-hmm.
Like that is a very, very important question that I think we have an onus on to ensure that we're actively doing this the right way.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything else for you that kind of stood out from our conversation with Amina?
Yeah, there's the idea around looking for differing opinions.
Yeah.
It relates a little bit to your comment about the algorithms, but in general, like there isn't necessarily a clear black and white answer for a lot of this stuff. And so having a perspective and appreciating the validity of someone else's point in this, I think is totally valid. And a good way to go forward, because there might not be the right answer when it comes to how do we best manage data, as an example. But having heard other people's opinions gives you a broader scope. And so like the idea around ignorance isn't really a good defense. Being able to include other people's ideas and thoughts in, an approach to becoming more ethical, I think is a really good idea.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. The more voices, the better.
Yeah. Anyways, really good. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
Yeah, just the one last thing. And we talked about it as we closed up as well, but technology is not a substitute for ethics.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that line.
Yeah. Yeah, me too.
I love that line.
Yeah, because we default to like that so often, right? Like the technology can do it. But maybe not.
But maybe
do we know it's doing it? Yeah. I mean, there's that what's his name? Dr. Fu, Fu Analytics, that makes me think
Fu
of
Analytics, yeah.
Where like just because you think you're putting impressions out doesn't actually mean you're putting impressions out. There's a whole bunch of bots and all that kind of stuff that's happening that you may not be delivering nearly the thing you think you are. And the same thing is true with ethics. It's even more ambiguous, I would say, than an impression.
Well, there's this new measure now. Like it's ability, like quality traffic is what they're calling it.
Yeah.
And it's like, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well,
like what does quality traffic mean?
It reminds me of non-viewable impression. Like, what?
Okay.
What's a non-viewable impression?
Yeah, I don't know. It's this intersection that we're at as marketers, the digital landscape, how it's constantly evolving. This ethics in our practices is going to be even more and more important as we continue to move forward. And I almost think about and I don't want to call them the early days, but it must have been great when you just had TV, radio, and print to really worry about, right?
Yeah.
And the ethics was really with the advertiser and how they were showing up.
Yeah.
Right. That it was really confined in one area. Whereas today, I don't know, pick a platform. Like it doesn't even matter. It's different. Every platform is different.
Yeah. Well, and because the algorithms, even within the platforms, they're not the same.
Yeah.
Right. There's so many, like experiences that are real to each individual person using it.
Totally.
Yeah, it's a weird one. That is a bit of a mind fuck.
It is, man. It is. Just do TV, radio, and print, everybody. That's the TLDR on this episode.
But where did the print paper come from? Is it ethically
That's
sourced?
fair.
Print?
As long as if it's ethically sourced paper, then go ahead.
Yeah. It's
I don't know.
Anyway, I do think, for me, the takeaway is it's important to have learning, like invest some time in understanding more. Like, it's not about like winning, a goal, scoring a goal when it comes to this. For me, it's more about like just progress. So investing some time into learn more about this. And then the other one is having a point of view, and that might end up being a policy for a company, which I'm going to think about for the Calgary Marketing Association for sure. Because we don't have one right now, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just continue to raise awareness. I think going back to what we talked about, we as marketers do have the responsibility, an active responsibility in here.
Yeah.
And making sure that we are the voices of the consumers being heard through our voices internally.
Yeah.
So don't.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to put a Canadian marketing code of ethics and standards in the link for us to look at from the Canadian Marketing Association, because I think it's a good idea to look at it and see what's in there in my case, what I can steal from that and what I can learn from it.
At least you're honest.
Yeah, totally. I don't need to recreate the wheel, but just to learn also their perspective on things.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay, buddy.
This was great, man.
Yeah.
Thanks, Amina.
V, we'll see you on the next episode.
We will.
I'm not sure what it's going to be right now, but I am very excited to chat with you again.
We got a pretty packed schedule. It's good. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
Yeah. Okay, buddy.
Right, man. Have a good one.
You too. Ciao.
Yeah. Bye.